Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, for the 11-year anniversary of the Wonky Angle, I'm talking about the 2007 album by Future Loop Foundation, Memories from a Fading Room. So, as I just said, today marks the 11-year anniversary of this channel. In years previous, I used to mark the occasion with a CD collection update. However, last year I decided to retire that format out of a lack of physical space to put new CDs and start up a new tradition to replace it. Simply reviewing one random album of my choice. Anything I want as long as I have an itch to break it down in full video form. I feel I can make it for a good opportunity to talk about certain stuff my other formats wouldn't really give me the space or opportunity for otherwise. I kicked things off last year by reviewing Programmed to Love by Bent, going back to this somewhat overlooked outfit who had one particular album I consider an all-time favorite, and I decided to do pretty much the same kind of thing this year, for an artist who's even more under the radar, and it's one that I don't think I was prepared for just how much I ended up having to say about it. So today we're talking about the UK downtempo producer Mark Barrott, also known as Future Loop Foundation. Now, while this is an artist who has one particular album that means way more to me on a personal level than all his others, I feel like he actually has a more interesting and detailed backstory than Bent, who were mostly overshadowed by their first album. The album I'm about to review is actually one of his less well-known works. He's known for having been early on the atmospheric drum and bass bandwagon in the mid-90s. More recently, his work under his real name, Mark Barrett, got quite a bit of attention, both through moderately reviving Balearic chill-out styles in the mid-2010s, and even putting out a decent amount of his most acclaimed work yet, or just over the past couple of years. There's actually quite a lot of interesting things to talk about with this guy's back catalog, both as FLF and as Mark Barrett, so how about I just quickly go down my thoughts on all his other stuff as a bonus. Here's my quick thoughts on his discography so far. So, Barrett's story starts all the way back in 1996, when Future Loop Foundation became the last artist to get signed to the short-lived Planet Dog label, made famous by other fellow signees, most notably Banco de Gaia in his prime, as well as Eat Static, Children of the Bong, and Time Shard. That was all the proper signees to that label, just those five and it was it. But anyway, the first album under the FLF name here is a very straightforward collection of atmospheric drum and bass. If you've heard stuff such as Goldie's Timeless from the year prior, you've heard a lot of the same kind of material that shows up here. There's even samples directly in common with other projects from the time, such as The Clock Ticking from Global Communication 7614, or multiple tracks that use the same vocal samples that Cold Storage used on his soundtrack to the original Wipeout game on PS1. This is generally nice for what it is, and all very cleanly produced, if perhaps a bit on the background music-y side. Also, while it was on the cutting edge for 1996, with this particular subgenre still in its infancy, even predating Photek's debut album by a year, albums that sound exactly like this are also kind of like a dime a dozen nowadays. You can probably find like 10 equally solid atmospheric drum and bass projects dropped on Bandcamp like every other month. And I'd be lying if I said I thought this stood out that much from the crowd by today's standards. It's cool, but Black Secret Technology it ain't. But his second album from 2 years later, also on Planet Dog, in my opinion holds up much better than the first one. It's still more or less the exact same kind of stuff, fairly straightforward atmospheric drum and bass formulas played straight, though the samples used here don't directly overlap with other semi-well-known tracks from the same era, which goes a long way in itself, and allows these tracks to be much more easily taken for what they are. But even beyond that, this album improves upon time and bass in nearly every conceivable way. The hooks are a bit catchier, the atmosphere and production more lo-fi, but equally as refreshing. Some tracks bang harder, there's more variety with tracks able to be more easily distinguishable from one another, and a couple of abstract hip-hop influenced detours that still fit well. There's even a couple of tracks here that go over 10 minutes and still make good use of their extended lengths. It still may not be anything that set the world on fire by today's standards or otherwise, but it's just an all-around very strong 90s drum and bass album that gives me very little to complain about. The third FLF album from 1999 is extremely rare. It only ever got released physically and has never hit streaming services aside from the track Coming Down being included on the compilation of remixes and one-offs. I had to hear an unofficial upload of this one from YouTube. I also nearly didn't think this would have qualified as a main album, considering it starts with an alternate version of the title track from his previous album, though everything else is original material. I suppose it could be a live album, since it does end in a track called Live at the Apollo, which is quite handily the best track here, by the way. And everything here feels like variations on the same sorts of ideas, as if partially envisioned as a live jam session all structured in one continuous set, but there's also no crowd sound, so I don't know. Either way, whatever you want to call it, it is a fun time. Better than Time and Bass, but less good than Conditions for Living. And now for something completely different. Fast forward to 2002, where he's completely changed up his sound into a mix of down-tempo, lounge jazz, and trip-hop, which would more or less set the tone for the rest of his career. Certain moments on his previous albums, such as Omerta and Coming Down, may have hinted at this direction, but all the drum and bass is completely gone, and in its place are lushly arranged jazz instrumentation with horn sections and vibraphones and hand percussion and sample flips over organic and summary hip-hop breaks. Some tracks like My Movie Is Like Life even bring in string sections as well. If you're a fan of acts like Morcheeba, Tosca, or the Cinematic Orchestra, or if the name Jaywalk means anything to you, it's directly along the same lines as all those artists. I do think some of the ideas presented here would be directly improved upon by other stuff he'd do on his next album, which is obviously the main topic of this video. Some of this stuff can be a bit on the background music-y and samey side, but all of it is very nice for what it is, and there are plenty of catchy and/or gorgeous highlights. Après Ski, Sun Comes Filtering Through, What's Your Name, My Movie Is Like Life Again, When Night Becomes Day, just to name a few. Very good album once again. Also, brief shout out to that Remixes and One-Offs compilation I mentioned earlier, which came out in 2007 but was clearly designed as a direct companion to this album. Like most compilations of its nature, it is really not essential listening, but I thought it was worth mentioning as it includes a remix from Fila Brasilia, which is cool, and a B-side called Jazz Mood No. 1, which I have a particular soft spot for and I think could have very easily made the cut for the main album and been one of the best tracks had it been included. Then we have the album as the main topic of this video, so we'll get back to that in a bit. Now, Memories from a Fading Room would be the last FLF album for quite a while, although in the 2010s his primary focus shifted over to putting out work under his real name, Mark Barrett, and starting up his own label called International Feel, which ended up getting a decent amount of success in its own right. This is something of another departure in sound and approach, albeit one that's very much aimed at the exact same sort of chill-out audience as something like This Is How I Feel, a combination of Balearic and New Age styles with a lot of tropical island-type vibes as promised by the title and cover. And it's nice for what it is, hits on the exact sort of pleasant, chilled-out atmosphere it's going for, although while I enjoyed it, I'd be lying if I said any of it properly wowed me. Most of it disappeared from my mind immediately after it was done. I did quite like the 10-minute closer, though. Half of it may just be field recordings of birds, but it also had some exceptionally pretty piano passages, so I'll take that. Though the sequel to that album 2 years later did feel like a pretty solid improvement upon the same ideas, making them more melodically striking and hitting some deeper emotional notes while maintaining all the same textural flares. Very solid once again. I think it's in a similar tier of enjoyment to me to This Is How I Feel. Now, he brought back the FLF name for one last comeback album in 2016. While obviously not an ending for his work in general, it is the most recent solo work he's put out under the FLF name specifically, and I suppose the functional ending for that alias. This was vaguely on my radar around the time it came out, although I think it was initially released as like a Spotify exclusive or something, and it was disorganized into a bunch of loose single releases that needed to be gathered into a playlist or something. Not being able to find a way to hear the project in its entirety at the time, I skipped over it. I only just found a download from Amazon Music recently while researching this video, but catching back up to it now, it's basically more stuff like the Sketches from an Island albums, kind of a combination of various tropical influences with a few downtempo synth and acid house adjacent styles, including one track called Shifting Horizon that has a very Giorgio-esque feel to it. Like the Sketches from an Island albums, it's pretty interesting and a pleasant time that achieves the chill vibes it's going for, although it's still maybe not the most memorable stuff I've heard in this vein. I think I like it more than the first sketches from the island, but less than the second. This album shows him returning to what he advertised as a more hardware-based approach, and his techno album, in air quotes, doubling down on all the most electronic and synth-centric parts of the last FLF album without nearly as much of the more organic sampled instrumentation, but still keeping the field recordings from Birds in the mix, so that he's basically getting like his Dominic Oilberg on, but with his usual more 90s downtempo Balearic house approach to everything. Pretty cool. And this album, originally envisioned as the soundtrack to an unreleased documentary, combines the style of his previous album with retro synth, classical piano, and strings, and jazz, for what has to be my favorite of his albums under his real name. This is the kind of thing I always like finding when I'm combing through Bandcamp Daily. It can hit in a similar way to that one Hannah Peel project from years ago, but combined with some of the piano stuff Rum Pistol was doing around the time too. It's great! And here's an album he made in the wake of his wife of 20 years passing away to a long illness. It's also a slight change up in sound. This is his most orchestral-centric album to date, with all sorts of strings and choirs being sampled, to match the bigger scale of grief, I suppose. I will freely admit it's the kind of album that likely needs the knowledge of that backstory to hit the best. I think the smaller and more subtle scale of Johatsu allowed that album to paradoxically hit more effectively for me. But all the same, this definitely hits on the sweepingly dramatic emotions it's aiming for, and many parts of it directly remind me of some of the most intense parts of, the album this video is primarily focused on, so I'm not about to complain about that. And it has its really strong, subtle moments too. Tracks like Mono Not Aware and It's Just Like Falling Asleep may have ended up hitting me the hardest out of the tracks here. And then finally, literally just a month ago as of recording this, and low-key the spark for me deciding on this topic for the anniversary review in the first place, he put out a brand new album called The Exit Diaries. It's kind of a mix of various different ideas explored on the previous two albums, among others. Some jazz elements, some modern classical stuff, some synth ambience, all adding up to the same sort of emotional movie soundtrack sort of vibe those last two albums had, structured into two 20-minute mini-suites. There may not be much unique to say about it in the overall context of his catalog, but it is very solid once again and hits on all the notes it's going for. So there we go. That's this guy's back catalog. Whole lot of different stuff he's done over the years, plenty of interesting stuff to check out. But the main focus of this video is the album he came out with back in 2007, what was also my initial introduction point to get into his work. So, the first time I personally heard about Future Loop Foundation was through one of the strangest promotional crossovers I've ever seen. Around the time this album came out, there was this little series of point-and-click flash games which were developing a pretty sizable cult following called Submachine. You may have heard that I've been mildly obsessed with that series and all the other works its creator Matthew Skutnik has been involved with over the years for most of my adult life at this point. I mean, I made a whole 40-minute video breaking down the Submachine soundtrack by Thump Monks a couple of years back. But anyway, at the time I was getting into the series in high school, I noticed that something of a black sheep for that series progression was the fact that one of the Submachine games was originally released as a promotion for Future Loop Foundation. I have absolutely no clue how that collaboration happened, but apparently Barrett got in touch with Skutnik, and Skutnik agreed to make a whole-ass Submachine game, even if a small spin-off, as a promotion for this one album from 2007. More recent re-releases of that spin-off took out the associations to Barrett, as Skutnik couldn't get in touch with him again to work out the permissions to reuse his assets. As such, it got a much more tonally fitting rescoring from Thump Monks, and old promo pictures were replaced with Skutnik's old family photos. But in the original Flash release of the game, its soundtrack was this album's intro, Stereo 72, endlessly looping. There was also a secret puzzle you could solve to find a pair of headphones that could play the first 10 seconds of the track Everything Is As It Should Be. You could look into rooms that had, like, a TV showing the FLF logo spinning around, or vinyl records scattered across the floor of, like, his Scratch and Sniff EP from around the time, among other things. The conceit of the whole spin-off was that you woke up in an insane asylum and had to figure out a way to recover recover your faded memories, as it were. Now, I didn't think much of this at the time I first came across it, as Skutnik got it to make sense in the series context in its own weird way, but the fact that this crossover ever happened in the first place is slightly mystifying to me in retrospect, since FLF, and this album in particular, is very mismatched for the tone of Submachine. It may be true that the name Future Loop Foundation sounds like a concept you learn about in the greater Submachine lore. I mean, the series already had an integrally important location in it called The Loop. But FLF is typically known for like warm and sunny down-tempo music, stuff that has lots of positive, uplifting, sentimental chill-out vibes, while Submachine is the polar opposite in tone. A very dark and isolated, almost horror-adjacent series, soundtracked primarily by creepy dark ambient drones with you going through various environments made of metal and concrete and rust and brick, and you never see a single human being in it until literally the last 30 seconds of the series' final installment. I don't think there was that much of an overlap between Submachine's target audience and the audience who FLF was primarily catered to. However, that very small overlap in target audiences did happen to include me personally, as a Submachine superfan who also happened to love downtempo chill-out of FLF's particular brand. So on the recommendation of that game's existence, I went out and bought the album on iTunes. And pretty much immediately after I heard the album for the first time, I developed a strong emotional attachment to it, and it ended up really cementing itself into my life completely independently from my Submachine obsession. I felt like it was making me nostalgic for something I had never experienced before. And of course, I'm sure longtime followers of the channel know it ended up cementing itself in my life enough where it ended up notching a spot in my top 20 favorite albums of all time. It ranked all the way up at number 19 when I made my top 100 list back in 2016, and if I were making an equivalent to that list again now, something I'm definitely not currently planning to do or anything, and certainly not for that list's 10-year anniversary this coming November. But if I were doing that, this would almost certainly still occupy almost the exact same spot on the list it did back then. This is an album that became so ridiculously personal to me that I actually kind of suspect the praise I'm about to give it is unlikely to line up with someone's first impressions hearing it from my recommendation. I mean, truth be told, if you heard this album and thought it was just okay and that I was way overhyping it, I would understand. I wouldn't necessarily call it the most original work. Some of its influences are very easy to clock, and it's not like an absolute masterwork of production either. It has its rough edges and spots. You can tell it is an obscure underground electronic project that someone made in the late 2000s. I can't deny that a big part of how it resonates as strongly as it does for me is just the specific point in my life that I heard it. But this album also felt uniquely equipped to take advantage of the specific point in my life I found it in order to leave such a lasting impression and continue to hit for me just as well all the way through present day, as I have the whole thing more or less committed to memory. It's an album literally about nostalgia, about rekindling fading memories and the fragility of life. An album entirely centered around the concept of sentimentality itself in the abstract. It's no wonder that it had me feeling nostalgic feelings even as a teenager hearing it for the very first time. Oh, by the way, just for the record, I will be discussing the original CD version of the album for this review, although this is not the version that's currently on streaming services. The version that is up on streaming and that I will be linking to in the description is actually a deluxe edition called The Fading Room Memories and Remixes, which, aside from attacking 8 remixes on at the end, does also slightly compress the original track listing. It's not such a major change as to actively undercut the album. In fact, that slightly compressed version was the one I heard first and got used to for the first couple of years before I bought the CD, but it is cut down a bit. Namely, the tracks Vision On and Garden Communities were compressed into one shorter track just called Garden Communities, and the outro track 1976 was cut altogether, which is much more of a loss, although given The Sea in the Sky is very clearly designed as the functional closer, that omission isn't the end of the world either. I'm not really going to comment on the remixes, they're fine. I like the Go Team remix of This Is Where We Live, I don't really have super strong feelings on the others. In any case, while I definitely prefer the original CD version, the streaming version will do you perfectly fine in a pinch. Also, my physical copy came with a companion DVD that adds the visual component of doing, like, basic iMovie level slideshow edits of his old family photos and, like, film projector home videos that look like they all came from the 70s. The visual component is obviously not necessary to enjoy the project. I actually only watched through it for the first time while researching this video, but it did give me a slight bit more perspective on the intentions and themes underpinning the whole thing, especially regarding the content of the spoken samples that appear throughout the project. But anyway, let's finally talk about the tracks on that original CD. The album's intro, Stereo 72, may only be a 1-minute ambient interlude, but it kinda got cemented as a key iconic moment in my mind as well. The fact that it was the primary background music of that above-mentioned Submachine spin-off is probably the primary reason for that, but it's also interesting to note that it's literally the only track on this album that actually fits in line with the typical soundtrack style of those games. It's a blend of, like, tonally ambiguous and formless abstract synth drones that starts up like a tape loop and has some barely present spoken voice counting in the background. It brings to mind imagery of, like, trying to get old technology working again, like a dusty old phonograph or some reel-to-reel tape projector from the 70s, or, I don't know, one of Wendy Carlos's old synthesizers from the 60s. It's neither warm or pleasant, nor is it dark or foreboding. It's totally neutral, a necessary warm-up for things to come. And I feel like as the album progresses, the emotional stakes slowly get raised higher and higher with every progressive track, as each new idea builds directly off the next in a partially continuous mix. The intro segues directly into the very Boards of Canada-inspired tones of On the Village Radar, which carries much of the same kind of lightly mysterious tone with all its bubbly but subtle synth progressions that eventually get surrounded in thicker bass drones later on, also featuring the first in a series of many lengthy spoken samples that appear throughout the album and are always fairly low mixed. This track has an interview with an older woman who mentions that she was born in 1904. She likes reading and gardening, and she's all around happy with the way her life's turned out. This is the start of a running theme throughout the album. As somewhat alluded to earlier, nearly every track on the album features low-mixed samples of this somewhat older child-sounding voice interviewing their various immediate family members. And of course, going by the credits on the CD, all of the family members in question are from 4 generations of the Barrett family. Mark Barrett's own grandparents and parents, and his siblings, and either his kids or his great-grandparents. I'm thinking the latter, since the majority of the spoken voices are from adults and older people, but I guess I don't know that for absolute certain. I also don't know if the interviewer voice is a young Mark Barrett himself, or someone else in his immediate family who let him use those tapes, but hey, they all answer the same sorts of questions. They introduce themselves by their birth dates, talk about their hobbies, their ambitions in life, which are always pretty low stakes, as well as other things we'll get to. But anyway, the melodic progressions on the Village Radar are repurposed and twisted around for the next pair of tracks, Vision On and Garden Communities, which, as mentioned before, are kind of functionally 2 parts of the same track, and literally just the same track in the case of the deluxe edition. To be honest, this is probably the weakest moment for the album, if only because right on first listen I instantly recognized the underlying percussion loop of ride cymbal tapping being a stock GarageBand loop. It's a sound that literally anyone with a Mac at the time this album released in 2007 would have had pretty easy access to. I'd even made tracks utilizing that loop myself around the same time, and I was only 12 years old in 2007. So that ended up serving as the most obvious reminder of how this is a pretty low-budget production at the end of the day. But I also won't belabor the point, since it's pretty much the only moment on the album that reminded me of that, and I've listened to this album so often as to be desensitized to it. Maybe even makes it a little more relatable as someone who produces music the same sort of way. And in any case, the tracks are still easily enjoyable ignoring that particular aspect. Like I mentioned, I kinda like how they take a very similar melody to that on the Village Radar and make it feel deeper and colder. Vision On surrounds it with some bassier and squirtier synth effects, with samples from a family member of a slightly younger generation, born in the 60s, and with ambitions to become a professional footballer someday. And Garden Communities, acting as the track's outro, introduces some new lip ear synth sequences. This pair of cuts is probably the most tonally ambiguous moment for the album as a whole. But as mentioned before, as we move further into the track listing, the emotional stakes progressively get raised higher and higher. The next 3 tracks form a directly interconnected trilogy, and all segue into each other to the point where they could all functionally be the same track. Although they are still easily distinct from one another. Of that trilogy, my favorite moment is probably its opening section, Everything Is As It Should Be. This is where the album really starts leaning into its most sentimental side. There's simple acoustic guitar strumming, lonely piano passages that get progressively warmer and more enveloping, even cinematic synth string pads. It's some of the warmest and coziest music I've ever heard in my life, quite frankly. But that's also contrasted by the spoken samples that show up here, which really get into another one of the overarching themes of this album and a much heavier undertone, that being surviving World War I and II. For the record, On the Village Radar did very loosely hint at this with like one mention of a bombing that gets glossed over super quickly, but the samples on this one discuss the topic much more directly. An old man, who I presume to be the great-grandfather, discusses his memories of experiencing an air raid, watching his entire village get bombed, although most of the bombs land in empty fields except for one that landed in a farmyard. They see the giant hole in the yard, and then when they come back to check on the woman in the farmyard house nearby, she's like, "Man, but I was enjoying a perfectly good cup of tea, though." I think I mentioned that Barrett is from the UK, if you didn't need the extra confirmation. I suppose there's some irony in a track discussing themes of, living in fear from bombings being titled Everything Is As It Should Be, but that does seem intentional, like it's more of an expression of relief that the family made it through such a time and survived intact, able to return from it and tell the tale years after the fact. But then we transition directly into Homegrown Dynamic, which retools the tune from that track into something else. Something that feels a bit cooler and spacier in tone, various retro-style synth washes and sequences layering over each other next to much thicker and heavier break beats, and some of the album's catchiest melodies overall. The spoken samples here also come from the littlest kid in the family at the time of recording, like a 5 or 6-year-old or something who maybe has heard some of those war stories in passing, but clearly is not old enough to understand what they mean. And when he wants to grow up, he wants to become a policeman or a garage man. Maybe stick with the latter. And finally, this trilogy culminates in Between Somewhere Beautiful, which just picks up the exact same mix from Homegrown Dynamic, does away with all the beats, and introduces all these steel guitars to jam out on top, getting some, KLF chill-out vibes out of that part. That track ends with some radio announcers in other languages and some radio station jingle, ba-ba-ba-da-ba, which leads directly into the next track, Experimentation Begins at Home, which is maybe the oddest moment for the album and sticks out a little bit like a sore thumb. All the warm and idyllic synth blends that color most of the rest of the album go away for this much quirkier blend of some, looping processed metallic bell toy sounds with some mildly off-kilter but kinda robotic organic percussion loops alongside radio hissing and static and some radio interview between 2 adult men. It's kinda hard to make out what the actual topic of the interview is, something scientific maybe. The samples are editing around the actual specifics of what they're talking about beyond something about difficulty in being accepted by the public. I don't know. The inclusion of this track could be very jarring given the abrupt change up in tone, and I wouldn't call it a major favorite in the track listing as a result of that, but it kind of just works anyway. The track moves at the same tempo as the tracks around it and flows well in and out of its surrounding moments. Add some interesting extra flavor to the experience as well. I wouldn't want it taken out of the track listing. But after this, we get the best stretch of the album, which gets even more warm and sentimental than anything on the album previously, which should be saying something. Especially once we hit the track, This Is Where We Live, which, the first time I heard this album, this was the track that had me instantly convinced this album was going to go down as a personal all-timer. There's no spoken samples on this one. The only voices are distant field recordings of kids playing in a playground. But Just musically, I was completely bowled over by the delicate blend of electric piano and regular piano melodies going up next to each other, next to upright bass, more cinematic synth strings, and melancholic steel guitars in the background, all collectively hitting the deepest emotional note out of any track thus far. I mean, actually, now that I think about it, some of the twinkly electric pianos in certain moments kind of remind me of the melody of the intro of BT's Anti-Cathara Mechanism. Do-do-do-do-do-do. And they even hit fairly similar emotional notes for me, which is by complete coincidence. I can't imagine there was any actual intention behind that parallel. It's just something kind of funny to note. I guess I'm a sucker for that kind of lullaby-ish electric piano tone. In any case, This Is Where We Live is the track where it feels like the album title is most directly invoked. Memories from a fading room. Memories formative to you on the verge of fading away. It feels like the soundtrack to, like, going to your old childhood home that you hadn't visited in years, and seeing a for sale sign in the front yard, and just kind of walking through the empty house anyway to see what it looks like. A reminder of time marching on, and how you can't really go back to how things were when you were a kid, but you still have those memories to hold on to in the moment, until even those memories will inevitably fade away. Lost in time like tears in rain, as it were. It's the feeling of pure nostalgia in musical form. Without question, my second favorite cut on this album. I'll get to my favorite later. But somehow that track may as well function as the intro to the following cut, Sunshine Philosophy, a 7-minute opus that takes us into the sunniest, happiest, and most uplifting blend yet, built on a dead simple chord progression swapping between C major and F major, but bringing in all sorts of rougher melodic synth effects, processed flute and woodwind sounds, acoustic guitars, and more, building up into absolutely immense payoffs with massive synth string pads and crashing, almost distorted breakbeats, delving right into traditional post-rock territory. It does play the typical post-rock formula pretty straight. If you've ever heard, like, The Earth Is Not a Cold Dead Place by Explosions in the Sky, this track feels very heavily inspired by that kind of thing. And it's a formula that many people have criticized for being super played out in more recent years. But at the time I heard this album for the first time, I had no idea what post-rock even was, so a track like this was kind of mind-blowing. Truth be told, this track and another one coming up are maybe the first tracks that come to my mind when I think about post-rock as a genre in passing, even if all of this was obviously electronically assembled. The loudness of many of the climaxes makes it particularly difficult to make out what any of the spoken snippets are saying, but it doesn't really matter since the emotional note of pure unbridled joy is so well nailed. Oh yeah, and there's even a moment in the track where it kinda sorta stops on the word stop. It doesn't stop completely, but there's a child's voice that says stop, and like the drums cut out and all the instruments sustain on one note that kind of dies out before the voice comes back that says, "Second minute go," and then it pays off in the first big drop. So that's a really cool moment. But anyway, on the flip side, after the album's most joyous climax yet, we get its loneliest and saddest moment in Eagle-Eyed, which switches over to a progression of much colder minor key synth pads, and that going up next to shuffling organic percussion, some incomprehensible icy vocoder effects, and finally some light pianos that come in right next to the interviewer child moving on to talk to his mom, or at least I think it's his mom, who was born in 1936, likes reading and gardening, and the local drama club, and her favorite musical instrument is the piano. It feels like the whole mix is frozen over from summer to winter, and there's just this heartbreaking hollowness to it. That's another one of the moments here that can most frequently get me to tear up a bit. But all of that still kind of pales in comparison to the album's functional closer, The Sea and the Sky, which is one of my favorite tracks ever made in any genre, full stop. Like, top 5 maybe. I didn't think the emotional stakes could get any higher than they already had with the last several tracks, but here's a track that just makes me feel all the emotions at once and gets even bigger scale than anything else, stretching out to just under 9 minutes total, starting out with breezy synth pads vaguely shaped to imitate some, like, far-off French horn and string combo, And then there's this simple repeating glockenspiel melody acting as the core hook. Do 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 do. Building into thick piano chords and satisfying electric bass lines, slowly crescendoing into another massive post-rock climax that's even bigger and more imposing than the climaxes on Sunshine Philosophy, crashing drum breaks being joined by huge, mellotron pads and even opera singer samples wailing out in the background, hitting the most grandiose heights imaginable. It's a track that evokes both pure joy but also aching sadness simultaneously, this is the most climactic, emotional ending that an ending could possibly be. And that's not even mentioning the spoken samples, which feel like as big a culmination for the themes explored elsewhere on the album as the music is. They take from that same, maybe great-grandfather who told the bombing story on Everything Is As It Should Be. He introduces himself as having been born in 1900. He kinda likes gardening, and his favorite flower is the rose. He was drafted into the army against his will in both the First and Second World Wars, even if he was only in the army during World War I for a total of 3 days. And he tells another story about surviving a bombing, except this one is even more intense than the one from earlier. He saw the Blitz come in over Sheffield and even got to see the bomb explode right in front of him and dirt and turnips get blasted everywhere. Just all kind of noted in a very matter-of-fact voice way in the background. But he still obviously lived to tell the tale and came out in one piece. Things could have gone a lot worse for him than they did. He was lucky enough to see more than one generation of children follow after him, after all. And his ambition in life, as mentioned in the final 10 seconds, is that he'd like to live to be 100. I would once again get it if someone heard a track like this and thought it stuck too much to the typical post-rock cliches. It even has another dead simple chord progression, but man, no album ending has gotten to me quite as viscerally as this one, or can, even get me to cry as easily. One of the primary examples in my mind of why all these musical cliches are still used so often. It got to me so much I ended up kind of ripping off the same idea when I made my own most recent album last year, called Real Life and Postcard Use. The closing track on there, Anything Not Safe Will Be Lost, was modeled very directly after this album and The Sea in the Sky in particular, right down to me including super low mixed voicemails from my grandmother. Sorry for the shameless plug, but you get the idea. The point is that this is a very big inspiration for me. Now, The Sea in the Sky is the closer on the album's deluxe edition, but the original version adds on one last track at the very end, called 1976. Now, I don't think it's physically possible to raise the emotional stakes any higher than the previous track already did, so what this track ends up functioning as is more like an epilogue. There's no beats, not really any crescendo, it's just formless blends of plinking pianos and keyboards and tranquil ambient pads. A pure exhale of relief that stretches on for an additional 7 minutes, and the spoken snippets that appear throughout this track are just reprises of snippets we've already heard on previous tracks. It does maybe feel a little like a tacked on bonus track, hence why I don't mind it having gotten cut altogether from the deluxe edition, but it still hits on the exact note it's going for all the same and can act as a nice little extra full circle sort of moment. It does make the album a little bit better by being there. So, there we go. That's finally everything to go through on Memories from a Fading Room. I don't really know what else to say besides this is a very special album for me. It's obviously not perfect, and I would once again totally get it if someone heard it and thought it was just mid. This wasn't an album that precisely introduced any new sounds or ideas the music world hadn't already heard, either on the more abstract ambient side in the beginning, which feels very Boards of Canada, or the more post-rocky side, which feels very standard Explosions in the Sky type fare, I suppose. Even if you were to ask me, I would say this absolutely blows BOC's own attempts at post-rock influenced styles themselves on Campfire Head Phase out of the water. I would also get it if the very nostalgia-heavy tone and the centering specifically on the theming of Barrett's relationships to his own immediate family would come off too schmaltzy for people, or possibly even bordering on coming off something out of conservative family values propaganda, right down to the patriarch being a war veteran. There's no mention of whether or not that grandfather actually killed anyone while he served in the army. I'll keep it my headcanon that he didn't. But still, if we're going to go there, I would personally argue that this album comes off to me less like a view of how everything is as it should be, as it were, and more like an expression of gratitude for how extremely lucky Barrett was to have as little stress in his own upbringing as he did, and an acknowledgement of the hardships his ancestors went through to get him a life as relatively comfortable as the one he enjoyed. Not to mention how glad he is to have had these family members in his life to support him, whether they're still around or not. And that's something I related to super heavily as well. I'm someone whose life could have very easily turned out way worse than it's currently going. I've lived through multiple catastrophic economic crashes and the complete destruction of the job market to AI, and still don't make enough money through any of my day jobs to have been able to move out of my parents' house. But I still have a healthy relationship with my parents, and with my 2 adult brothers who also still live in the same house. The 5 of us are able to pitch in where we can to keep living here. And my Austrian-born grandmother is still alive and well, too. She's in her mid-80s. She was born on a Nazi-run labor camp and lived part of her childhood in a chicken coop during the war. But she's somehow still in good shape and ridiculously active for her age. We visit her about once a week because she physically can't help herself but cook dinner for large groups. Nothing makes her happier than having the whole family over for dinner and a card game. There's not a day that goes by where I don't feel extremely lucky that I still have these people in my life and that I have this roof over my head at all. In slightly different circumstances, I feel like I could have very easily turned out homeless, and you never see me talking about music on the internet. These are the kinds of things that I think about whenever I put this album on. I guess I don't know how well it would hit for someone with a more complicated or less well-off living situation than my own. Maybe it would feel too sappy and saccharine for some of those people and like too much of an idealized version of reality. Or maybe some people would question whether this is the reality to idealize to begin with. Like if someone were to say it felt too white and English for their liking, I wouldn't really be able to argue with that either. I don't know, but at the end of the day, all I can say is that it's an album that I've held extremely close to me for many years now and has been a major inspiration for me, and that it deserves to get a hell of a lot more attention and notoriety than it currently enjoys. I don't imagine too many people have heard about it to begin with outside of my one mention of it on my favorites of all time list a decade ago, but I will reconfirm that it gets nothing but the highest of my recommendations, and I'm overall feeling a 9.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people, you want to add yourself to that list, or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. Yes, the schedule is still open. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today, see you next time.